Hello and welcome to another lesson from this series covering edXL's conflict poetry anthology. In this lesson we're going to be looking at War Photographer, a poem by Carole Satyamurti. Now the first thing we're going to do is have a look at some context behind the poet. Carole Satyamurti is an award-winning poet interested in the link between psychology and writing. So her poems look at subjects very much from a human and psychological perspective. As well as being a poet, she was also known for being a sociologist. Now, sociology is the study of human behaviour and society. Now, the poem we're going to look at today, War Photographer, is obviously going to look at war, but rather than the poet focusing on specific dates and times within history in terms of a specific war, it's going to approach war generally from a human perspective and how humans deal with war, how they process war, and indeed how they process conflict and trauma. So this very much, as I said, reflected in her poem War Photographer, looking at war and photography from a perspective of human behaviour. Now the next thing we're going to do is simply read through the poem before going back and analysing the poem in line by line detail. Okay. The reassurance of the frame is flexible. You can think that just outside it people eat, sleep, love normally, while I seek out the tragic, the absurd, to make a subject. Or if the pictures, such as lifts the heart, the firmness of the edges can convince you this is how things are. As when at Ascot once, I took a pair of peach, sun-gilded girls, rolling, silk crumpled on the grass in champagne giggles. As last week, when I followed a small girl staggering down some devastated street, hip thrust out under a baby's weight. She saw me, seeing her, my finger pressed. At the corner, the first bomb of the morning shattered the stones. Instinct prevailing, she dropped her burden. A mouth too small for her dark scream began to run. The picture showed the little mother, the almost smile. Their caption read, "Even in hell, the human spirit triumphs over all. But hell, like heaven, is untidy. Its boundaries arbitrary as a bloodstain on a wall." Okay, so let's have a look at the first line together. So it says, the reassurance of the frame is flexible. What does this word frame mean? It simply refers to the area that the photograph covers. So everything, the environment, the setting and the people, everything inside it is within the frame. And it says the reassurance of the frame is flexible. So the comfort that people get out of what's inside the frame and what's outside of the frame is flexible, it varies. This doesn't really make a great deal of sense at this point, so let's carry on and the meaning will become clearer. So it says, you can think that just outside it people eat, sleep, love normally. So really what the poet is getting at here is that when there is something terrible in a photo, we want to assume that everything outside it is fine. So although what the photo is covering, outside it people are eating, sleeping, loving normally, and people want to almost lie to themselves. The poet is suggesting that the photo is just the photo in isolation, that yes, the photo in a war scenario might be horrendous and horrible. Outside it, life goes on as normal. People can kind of kid themselves. They get reassurance that what's in the frame is just that. It's within the frame. And the poem carries on, while I seek out the tragic, the absurd to make a subject. There's almost a slight criticism of the idea of war photography. He or she seeks out the tragic and the absurd. It almost has a slight predatory note to it, as if the photographer is deliberately preying on absurd and tragic situations just to make a subject. And after all, this is his job, so he or she gets paid to take war photographs. So it's his job to seek it out. And linking to this idea of the reassurance and comfort someone gets from a photo being flexible and changing, this ties with the next line. Or if the picture's such as lifts the heart, the firmness of the edges can convince you this is how things are. So in other words, when a photo is tragic, we think that the frame is flexible. So we think that when something's tragic, outside the photo is normal and happy, etc. So when the photo itself is positive, we think this is how things are. Whereas when it's not positive, we think, oh, that's just the photo. Now, if we go on, the poet says, or the speaker says, as when at Ascot once. Now, what is Ascot? So it's a horse race that takes place every year, and it's notable for its attendees being often very privileged and wealthy. So every year, members of the royal family itself will even attend, as well as many other wealthy individuals, and it's known for women particularly dressing in a very glamorous manner. The next line, I took a pair of peach sun-gilded girls. So again, has a very positive, almost trivial tone. This is a scene of glamorous women, very well-dressed, or very glamorously dressed, enjoying the beautiful British summer weather. And so it's a very light-hearted scene that the poet paints at this stage. And there's reference here, if we go on to the next line, rolling silk crumpled on the grass in champagne giggles. So we can really envisage what's going on here. These references, silk and champagne, clearly references to great wealth. These are wealthy individuals enjoying the summer weather in this horse race, but really it's more than a horse race. It's the event of bringing people together. And obviously, as a photographer, this job title, photographer, encompasses people taking pictures of glamorous people at a horse racing event, and it also covers photographers whose job it is to take pictures of the worst aspects of humanity, which is obviously war. And we go on in the third stanza, as last week when I followed a small girl. So even this, it carries on with that predatory tone, following a small girl. So he or she follows a small girl staggering down some devastated street. So again, staggering suggests that this is something that a child shouldn't have to do. They're staggering. They can't walk properly, and we'll find out why this girl can't walk properly, down some devastated street. So it creates almost normalizes what's going on, some devastated street, suggesting that devastation is in fact normal within this environment. It's just one of many devastated streets, devastated by presumably heavy artillery, and we can just almost imagine here quite clearly a street that's almost been completely decimated by war. So this girl, her hip thrust out under a baby's weight. So it's an absurd, horrible image, the idea of a small girl taking on the role of a mother, carrying a baby. It's a very unnatural, disturbing picture that we have here. So it says, she saw me seeing her. So it creates almost an uncomfortable relationship between the war photographer and their subject, that they're not just totally distant. There is a human interaction going on here, that the subject notices that she's being the subject of a photograph. So it says, my finger pressed. So it almost summons images of a gunman with their hand pressed on a trigger, almost as if on the verge of committing a crime here. Obviously, we know that no crime has been committed. This is simply a war photographer doing their job. And we go on here, at the corner, the first bomb of the morning. Again, totally normalising what's going on. The first bomb of the morning, as if it's become quite casual. Well, just the first bomb of the morning. We expect more to happen during the day. And it shattered the stones. Instinct prevailing, she dropped her burden, and mouth too small for her dark scream, began to run. So she dropped her burden. Again, this word burden, obviously, it is a burden, and a burden that a young girl in any normal scenario should never have the burden of a child. And to be the primary caregiver. However, in this absurd, awful situation, that is the case. And this absurdity is just further reinforced. Mouth too small for her dark scream. A child should never have to go through what she is experiencing. And so the poet really reinforces the idea that this dark scream is not befitting for a child. Her mouth's too small for such a dark scream to appear to come out of this child's mouth. Began to run, and there's an ellipsis here suggesting we don't know her fate. And this is very interesting because obviously a photo is a still moment, so we don't know her fate. And actually, although really the photographer would know her fate had they continued to monitor her, actually, if we just see one isolated photo from a war, we don't know the full fate and context of a picture. We get this moment in time. We don't know what happened before, and we don't know what happened after. And this is the nature of war photography. So we go on. The picture into the final stanza, the picture showed the little mother, the almost smile. So again, this idea of photos, they can be used to impart meaning when the meaning can be almost misconstrued. The almost smile, she's about to scream, but as her lips form that scream, the still life photo records the event as an almost smile. Okay, so let's have a look. It says their caption read. So this is the power of war photography. You take a picture, you print it, you put it a caption. Really, the photographer has a lot of power because they can decide the context. They can caption the photo, give it meaning. As we're stripped from the photo, as it's not a video, it is up to the newspaper to decide how that photo comes across. And the caption read, even in hell, the human spirit triumphs overall. But really, it isn't a smile. The photographer has taken the picture just at the moment in time where, as I said, the mouth is forming an almost smile, and they've almost misconstrued the photo. So even in hell, the human spirit triumphs overall. So the newspapers decided to run a story that even in this war scenario, the child is still making time for laughter and being a child. However, we know from the actual context that this is not the case. So they've misconstrued what's going on. But we go on. But hell, like heaven, is untidy. So this really goes back to the idea of a frame. That the war photographer decides the frame, but actually war is untidy and hell and heaven is untidy. You can't possibly portray a full human experience of war just in the frame of a photo. So although you can print a photo and caption it and try and package that experience of war in a single photo. This poem is saying, actually, really, that's impossible. You can't possibly portray the complexities of war just in a photo. It's untidy. War is untidy. You can try to tidy it as much as possible, but ultimately you can't. Its boundaries arbitrary as a bloodstain on a wall. It's this idea of arbitrary meaning random. There is no neat packaging of war. It is random, chaotic, tragic. The boundaries are as arbitrary and random as a bloodstain on a wall. So just like if you were wounded in war, that bloodstain would fly everywhere in a random, chaotic manner. It's the same in war. You can't contain war within the narrow frames of a photo. Obviously, as a war photographer, you may try to, but ultimately the poet is saying that's false. Human experience is too complex for that. And that really goes back to the context of Carole Satyamurti being a sociologist. She's really interested in the complexities of the human experience, particularly within the context of war and trauma. Okay, so the last thing we're going to do is we're going to have a look at the form and structure of the poem. So let's start off with form. Now remember, the form generally refers to the type of poem as well as the shape, size and number of the stanzas. So let's start off by looking at the type of poem. So it's a dramatic monologue. Okay, so the purpose of the dramatic monologue, obviously it's told from one narrator's perspective, and actually that really links to the idea of war photography, or even photography in general. It is quite a lonely occupation. It is just you and your subjects, and there is quite a detachment often between the photographer and their subject. And often photographers would be alone for large periods of time as they, as it says in the poems, seek out the tragic and the absurd. And obviously this takes a long time to do that. So the dramatic monologue almost reflects that loneliness. So the poem makes use of first and third person perspective. So as I mentioned when I was talking about the dramatic monologue, the first person perspective is really used to give that sense of the photographer and the human experience of photography as they seek out their subjects. But the third person perspective almost serves to create that detachment, although what they're taking pictures of are often very tragic and emotive things. The photographer, almost for the sake of their own well-being, has to maintain that emotional detachment. So when the tragic war events are being described, it's notable that the little girl is described from third person perspective to really portray that almost professional level of detachment in the relationship between photographer and subject. So inconsistent stanza sizes, if we have a look at the stanzas, as we can see, they vary quite a lot, and there's no real consistent pattern that we can overtly mark out. Why is this? Well, it really does link with that core message of the poem, which is war is chaotic, tragic, and messy, and you cannot contain it within the single frame of a photograph. And any attempt to do that, as I mentioned before, is ultimately false. So inconsistent stanza sizes perfectly links to the idea of war being inconsistent, something you can't package neatly together. Why should the poet package her ideas into neat stanzas? Okay, so in terms of structure, and remember, by structure we're generally referring to the rhyme scheme and the use of punctuation. So it's blank verse. There is no real rhyme scheme, and again, linking to that idea of chaos and the sprawling, arbitrary chaos of war, and just like having a frame of a photograph, calling that the frame, just as that would be false. If you were to impose a rhyme scheme on the poem, that would also be a false attempt to neatly package war. So in terms of punctuation, the poet makes use of an ellipsis as well as dashes. So if we go back, there is an ellipsis here, as I've said earlier, to show that sense of the unknown. We don't know her fate. There is also uses of a dash here, weirdly at the start of a stanza, and again, there's use of a dash here. Perhaps it's almost marking out the frame of a photograph, and quite interestingly, it links ideas of tragedy to this rather trivial scene at Ascot, again as perhaps as juxtaposition, but also to tie it all together and say that actually all of this is photography, whether you're at Ascot or whether you're there to photograph war. All of it is contained within this single occupation name of photographer. Okay, I hope you found that useful, and there will be more lessons like this covering the rest of the poems within the Edexcel Conflict anthology. Thanks for listening.